So music is huge. It can either make or break something, totally. It's so delicate because if you get it wrong, as earlier discussed, you can really manipulate people's emotions in the wrong direction. Is it okay to manipulate people's emotions at all? I think if you can get in the service of the storytelling and be true to their intention, yes, it is.
Welcome to The Format by Chorus Studios. Technology is always changing, and so is the format, or how we produce and consume media. The Format is a monthly newsletter on Substack and a podcast, where I, Flo of Chorus Studios, talk to you, producers, co-hosts, founders, about the newest and the best practices in podcasting today and tomorrow. From technique to technology, we will explore what new AI tools are podcasters using and why. How to prep for a podcast interview as a host or a guest. Which mics are best for your budget? And even, what happens in your brain when you listen to a podcast? These are all questions I will be asking on The Format. This series will allow me an opportunity to continue learning and growing as a podcast producer and share those learnings with you. So I hope you'll join me on The Format on Substack. So this episode was pretty cool because I got to sit down with someone in Australia. That someone is Siobhan McHugh. I found Siobhan on the internet, of course. I stumbled upon her book, The Power of Podcasting, Telling Stories Through Sound. Siobhan is an award-winning writer, documentary maker, and podcast producer, co-producing podcasts including Phoebe's Fall, Wrong Skin, and The Last Voyage of Pongsu. She's also the consulting producer for The Greatest Menace, a queer true crime podcast. I was really impressed by her book, the ways that she was able to describe the choices we make as audio producers, where and how we put music or sound effects, how we approach an interview as a journalist or a storyteller. And not only is she able to describe it, she's also studied it and is an honorary associate professor at the University of Sydney, Australia, where she launched the Hub for Innovation in Podcasting. There's so much here in this conversation, you guys. Let's jump into it. Well, it's so nice to meet you. Thanks for your time today.
You're welcome. Yeah.
I have your book right here.
Oh, good.
First of all, what's the correct way to pronounce your name?
Siobhan. So Siobhan McHugh. Yeah, Siobhan. It's a Gaelic name, so it's a bit difficult. Yeah, Siobhan.
I love it. I'm Florence, but I go by Flo. You can call me either.
Okay. Great. And you're in Raleigh. We were in North Carolina, in Durham, visiting a friend in UNC. Yeah.
Cool. When was that?
Oh, that was ages ago. John Biewen, he actually does the Scene on Radio podcast. It's quite a well-known one.
Cool.
Yeah, he had just written that book, Reality Radio. This book, Reality.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very good. He's got everybody, Ira Glass, Sarah Koenig, Jad Abumrad, they're all in there. They're all friends of his.
It's cool that you've been in my neck of the woods. I have never been to Australia. That's still on my list. I was actually just listening to the first season of Serial, and that's Sarah Koenig, right?
Koenig, yeah.
Koenig.
Sarah Koenig, yeah.
Because I remember back in 2014, 2015,
yeah,
the first season of Serial, I just was definitely one of the reasons I became interested in podcasting. I went back and listened to it just today, and I was like, wow, this is still really good. Like, I'm still into it. Anyway.
I think part of that was that they didn't realize at the time at all how big it was going to be, and they were just having fun with it and just playing in the pond kind of thing. They'd been given a budget. They were allowed to do whatever they wanted. They had no set expectations, and so that really comes through. They just had fun. Although, I mean, obviously serious stuff too. Yeah.
I feel in my soul that I can tell when someone's being authentic in a podcast. And I felt like in her voice in that first season, it was so relaxed and authentic, and like you were in the room with her, and it wasn't over dramatized. It was sort of, matter of fact, but like super curious. And I don't know, I think that just comes through when it's there. You can't always make it happen, the magic of being your full self on the, in a microphone. But when it happens, I think you feel it. So it's my opinion.
Yeah, I think so. I agree totally. I just hope, people keep saying that AI can mimic that, but I actually feel it can't.
No, I think there's human to human magic there.
Yeah.
Well, I was doing some more background research on you. I think I just found your book on Amazon randomly. That's how I discovered
good.
you.
Yeah.
I was just looking for books about podcasting. I also love graphic design, and I just love the design. So I was like, oh, kind of got me. And then, but I think the book is excellent. I mean, even if you're a beginner, an intermediate, or advanced, I think there's so much in the book that anyone can take away. And then I realized you're a professor, so you teach. So I was thinking probably the reason why the book is so good at explaining how to think about telling an audio story and how to think about being a journalist and think about being a producer and script writing is because you're a teacher.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah. And I suppose my mission has always been to try and convince skeptical students and others, people out there in industry who come from video or film or print backgrounds, how special audio can be. And I kind of feel as if there's this wall of skepticism out there because audio was never as sexy in the old days anyway as their format, which they thought was flashier or better or cooler or whatever. And so I always felt as if I was coming from behind some invisible handicap that I had to overcome. And so I'd give it that extra mile and really try and, convert them almost, which was really quite evangelical about it. So, yeah, I had to go 110% to get a bored student, who's tired and they're sitting there only because they have to be there. And you can feel that they're bored. You have to really grab them by the throat kind of, and suck them in. And I've done that. People have come up to me at the end of a semester and said, kind of almost embarrassed, I never thought it could be that good. And now I'm going to switch. I'm going to be an audio producer and all this sort of stuff, which is great. It's like a win. Yay.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I listened to the first, like a couple trailers and first episodes of several of the shows you've helped produce. And they're all very scary, but they are very, it'll just grab, the audio and the story, the murder mysteries are very entertaining.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you could use some of that material with your students as well.
Well, actually, one of them, the very first one, Phoebe's Fall, two of my students worked on it, and we got them credits as assistant producers. They helped with transcribing, but I would come back on a Thursday and we'd have a class on a Friday. I'd have been working on a draft in studio in Melbourne the day before, and I would actually play bits of the unfinished episode and use them as a focus group almost and say, what do you think? And because this was about a young woman who was, 24 when she died, they could really identify. And so they might ask a question that we wouldn't have thought of because they were in the demographic. And so, we did kind of take their views into account. So they were almost like an unofficial focus group for that first one, which was really special. Yeah.
That's cool. Because I think the thing about storytelling is anyone can be a good judge of it. You don't have to be an expert.
Oh, absolutely. One of my big litmus tests for what's working in podcasts and what's going down is I always ask my hairdresser.
Yeah.
And if she gets enthusiastic, I know I'm onto something.
When I first discovered podcasting, it was mostly all narrative stuff. Serial, S-Town, others I can't think of the names of. But as time has progressed, I've gotten really into conversational podcasts. Like, I really love Dax Shepard, Armchair Expert, and I'll admit I like some of the very popular ones, like, what's her name? Oh, Call Her Daddy.
Daddy, yeah.
I feel like there's been like a trending towards the talk versus the narrative, but what do you think? Is that a thing, or am I just imagining that?
Oh, there is. Somebody has said that about 80% of the podcasts out there now are that kind of talk conversation format. And I think that's probably right. And in fact, some people think when they think podcast, they just think that's what it means. You know, they don't even know that there are other kinds of podcasts. And partly I think it's because obviously it's much easier and cheaper to do than a
Yes.
narrative podcast. It doesn't take
Yes.
anything like the time. But also it does have appeal. I mean, sure, if you get the right chemistry of hosts and the right kind of topic or theme that they tend to talk around, it's nice. I mean, for instance, I like that one, Normal Gossip. I find that quite fun, especially when she's kind of bouncing off a good guest who can really suck you into whatever fairly trivial but enchanting kind of story that they're looking at. It's like sort of eavesdropping on a friend's chat. And I think that's something we can all identify with. So yeah, it's a very strong format. Yeah.
Very revealing. So we could talk a little bit about your career, about how you got into the medium and why you're still in it, you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I started in radio after a kind of random few years. I didn't study journalism or anything. I studied science, and then I got more interested in issues about science. So really I was almost being a journalist then. I wanted to know about the politics, the history, the ethics, rather than stand in the lab watching pipettes drip through until 5 p.m.
Yeah.
I was really interested in the people stuff behind the science. And that still remains my focus, people, and what motivates people and what they get up to. And I'm glad I did science because at least I'm literate in science, and it's important, obviously, for environment and climate and health and everything else. And then I just fluked a job in the radio station, and they trained you. I just was in the right place at the right time, and I fronted up and I kind of charmed them at the interview. And I wonder, do they regret that now? But anyway, I got in, and I think I loved the connectivity of radio. I could feel that when you had a good guest in studio. So we did a lot of exploring social issues in those days, you know, women fighting inequality in different ways, maybe in the workplace. We didn't even have words for things like sexual harassment in those days, although of course it was going on. But it was interesting, the kind of feedback you'd get, the listeners ringing in, and you could put different voices on air when they'd phone in. But then I moved into making documentary, and that was just a revelation. It was a license to go into somebody's home and ask them the most probing questions about their life that you would never normally dream of asking them because you were crossing some boundary. And then I got sort of seduced by the art of it, how you could change and enhance, sort of tighten a story, make it more engaging, not changing, misrepresenting them, but just sort of, it was like if you had somebody who was being boring at a party and you could just rewind and get rid of the boring bits and the repetition that set in after the second drink and just get the clear, pure story out of them. And that's what I loved. And that's what I still really find fascinating, the invisible art, as I call it, of audio storytelling. Yeah.
I'm with you. It's so gratifying pulling out the bits that are the most poignant. Did you work in documentary film at all, or just documentary audio? Or
I did work in documentary film. I worked on 2 or 3 big series, projects that came out of my radio work and my writing work. And then people came to me and said, hey, we want to make a documentary series about this. I was scriptwriter on a big series on the history of the Irish in Australia called Echo of a Distant Drum. And weirdly, actually, a friend of mine, a colleague from ABC Radio, who's a great radio producer, she just messaged me yesterday, and she'd been in Ireland and she just looked up this Irish in Australia, and she found that documentary on YouTube, even though it's really old. And she said it stands up really well.
Oh, good.
And that was my first experience on learning the difference between television and audio. And yes, the enormous power and reach that TV has, the impact it can have on people is huge. But it's also very limiting. And, you know, I used to be horrified by the way they would constrain the story. Even before you set out to do the interview, they would have a shot list. We're going to take this shot. He'll be walking along here. He'll do this, blah, blah, blah. And there wasn't the same room for spontaneity and organic discussion that I always love and that drives all the radio stuff I do or the audio podcast stuff I do, where you just, yes, you do a bit of background research, of course, but, and I always have questions, but I don't follow them slavishly or religiously. You go with the flow, and there just isn't the room to do that in TV.
That's so cool. I mean, I'll be honest here. I always wanted to do video, and I would love to do interviews, take content that I collected in some kind of project and have it turn into a documentary or a series or something. I think that'd be the coolest. But I think the amazing thing about audio is it really is the foundation for video. Well, that was what I learned in grad school, which was mostly video focused, but I did a class on radio and podcasting. Just really how you really should put the audio first and the image second. You can watch a crappy looking thing if you can hear it clearly, but you can't watch a beautiful thing if the music is crap. That doesn't work. Yeah. So audio first, always, even for video.
Exactly. And I love that. There's a thing going around with Johnny Depp on Pirates of the Caribbean, and they show that famous scene when he jumps into the water and he's going to go and land on the island, and they play it with different kinds of music, like one for comedy, one for terror, one for tragedy. And it just shapes how the same guy, the same expressions, everything's the same except the music. And I mean, it's I've shown it to my students, and it's a bit over exaggerated, but it shows you very clearly. Yeah.
I've been kind of just Googling randomly, what happens in your brain when you listen to a podcast, and I get like these kind of fluffy articles without any research.
Oh yeah, there are people doing real research where, they hook people up to scanners, MRI scanners, and they check what bits of the brain are firing. When, like, they've done some research. Emma Rodero is a Spanish researcher in Barcelona. She's done some work on this, but more in relation, I think, to fiction and also to do with advertising, but similar principles. And also in Australia, they hooked up students and they checked with binaural sound, really lush, stereophonic kind of sound. If you started adding in, let's say, footsteps as somebody's listening to a story, so that the tension heightens, what happens in their different parts of the brain, the hypothalamus and all these different parts light up that are linked to things like the amygdala, like empathy and whatever. But I can't find the exact. There are people studying it, and it's an area I'm really interested in, because we do know at an intuitive gut level that it works. We know. I mean, I literally have watched people. I play them one version of something, and then I play them another version, and I did a famous experiment, actually, well, for me, because I played it to hundreds of people. It was a woman in the Vietnam War, a journalist, an Australian woman called Jan Graham, who had witnessed some awful things. And I wrote about her in my book. And then I played for this big online course that had people from 150 countries and 30,000 people over a few years. And I would ask them to listen to her describing this awful scenario where she tries to comfort a GI who's been injured in a mine blast, and he dies in her arms. And I asked them to say, which affected them more, the print version, which is verbatim what she's saying, or the audio. And like 90% chose the audio as much more affecting. One man said it so beautifully. He said, when I read Jan's story, I felt sad. When I listened to her telling her story, I cried. And that was the difference, the exact same experience. But when you could hear the obvious pain and the gulping and the sobs in her voice, the little spaces between the words, and that was raw speech that had no music of any kind. I did not use it because it would have been wrong to juice it up and kind of tamper with the authenticity of the emotion. Yeah.
So what you just said just reminded me of another question I had for you that I think would be interesting for us to talk about, which is, journalism and storytelling. I feel like there's some big ethical journalism rule book I don't have access to that I want, because but that's that's maybe not how the world works. You know, we live in a gray world, and podcasting just makes it even more gray because, you know, the way you add music or don't add music to a story can just change the entire perspective of that story. So what have you learned from some of your experiences to be ethical in your storytelling whilst also being emotional?
Well, there was one instance in a podcast, that podcast Phoebe's Fall, where we were trying to create the backstory for who was Phoebe before she died tragically in this incident. And the podcast tries to investigate, was it murder, suicide, or an accident? She's found at the bottom of a garbage chute in this luxury apartment building. So when we're filling in her background, we find out that she had relationships with older men, which is really interesting because so did her mother and so did her grandmother. There was a kind of tradition of these three women. And we interview both the mother and the grandmother, who are both, you know, wonderful women, talking about this. In one case, the mother is talking about how she had a relationship with her PE, her physical education teacher, who was something like 30 and she was 16. And he did leave her school, but there was quite an imbalance there. Right. And it wasn't illegal. In this state of Victoria, that was okay because 16 is the age of consent. There are still issues around power differential between a teacher and a pupil or an ex-pupil. And we wanted to let that hang there and kind of let the listener think for themselves. Is this okay? Or is this a bit weird? Is this a bit off? And so I had put on the script music bridge. And the first person who was working on it put in this music that was all romantic and schmaltzy. And they're talking about the relationship. And suddenly we as listeners are made to feel, oh, this is so lovely. It's gorgeous. So that was like editorially endorsing this relationship through the music, which was not what I wanted as a co-producer at all. So I said, no, strip that out, something much more neutral, just chords. We want music that just hangs there and almost acts like a kind of a spatial thing rather than a tonal certainly not an endorsement. It has to be neutral. So that was an example where, you know, in my head, I knew the kind of music I wanted, but it's very hard to convey that. And somebody else, probably just because they worked very quickly and weren't as immersed in the actual editorial aspect. So they just think, oh, it's a relationship, put this in. Yeah. So things like that can go really wrong and can really kind of shift the meaning 180 degrees from where you want it to be. And we had that again with The Greatest Menace, which is the podcast about the gay prison that has done really well, that I spent 2 years working on, and Pat and Simon, the co-creators, spent another year. And we had a really sad story about a man who had spent 60 years in the closet, afraid to come out. He was living in Florida when he heard about our podcast. And we had this whole bonus episode with him. And again, we have this beautiful moment, spoiler, where, you know, we get his criminal record erased and he's a free man at the age of 86. It's unbelievable. And he starts breaking down and crying when he reads this formal apology and removal of his record from the Department of Justice. And we just wanted the raw emotion there because it is absolutely spine-tinglingly beautiful. And he's saying, oh, I wish I could run on the beach, except now I'm too old. I can't run anymore. And it's and it's gorgeous. And unfortunately, again, it was a public holiday. This is what happens. So our great music guy was off on holiday, and some random person who didn't know the context just whipped in this Hollywood kind of, you know, violins, and they drowned out the actual emotion and really trivialized it and made it sort of sound ho-hum. And,
like
we oh God, it was awful. So luckily we were able to get it out before it got published, and then we got our real guy back, and we just had 2 minutes of just speech before you even hear these little chords then just drop in, and they kind of support him as the story unfolds. And it's an absolutely beautiful moment. I use that as a teaching example, in fact. So music is huge. It can either make or break something totally. So it's like using that is so delicate, because if you get it wrong, as earlier discussed, you can really manipulate people's emotions in the wrong direction. Is it okay to manipulate people's emotions at all? I think if you can get in the service of the storytelling and be true to their intention, yes, it is. You're not actually manipulating, you're heightening or supporting the emotion that's already there. Yeah.
And gosh, I often wish I had, my own private composer.
Yeah.
Music, getting the right music can be really hard, especially if you're working on a budget but you have good taste and you want to find the right thing, and it can be very tricky.
But you could try and pair up with, say music students or people like that who are composers in waiting, because, it's a win-win. They get to kind of play around with different themes, and then if it works, they can use it as a selling point on their CV. You can go to freemusic.org, but the first few podcasts we did were using libraries of music, and it's much harder and there's no coordination. Mm-hmm. It is great to get a composer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's a good idea. I will think about that. Mm-hmm. I don't have any narrative projects right now, mostly because as soon as I break it down to people what it will cost, typically not in their budget. But, when you're working for a production company like you have with a team of incredible people, I think that's kind of what it takes to put something together that's artfully crafted. And anyone who pulls it off without a team of people and a nice budget is a miracle child. So it is amazing. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, that is the hardest thing to get people to realize. Because unfortunately what we do sounds deceptively easy, and because it isn't flashy and on a streaming TV service or whatever, people think it just makes itself and that it's dead easy and therefore cheap, and it isn't. I mean, I did see somebody from the US industry saying that at a podcast industry event that $250,000 was the minimum to get off the floor, was the way she put it, for a narrative podcast project. And that kind of tallies with the work I've done, where I have estimated, talking to producers and time and people's skill level, that they got $40,000 to $50,000 per hour of narrative podcast. So if you take a podcast like, say, S-Town, which is, I think, about 6 to 7 hours, if you just, and per unit, it would need something like 350,000 or 300 to 350,000 to make it. So I mean, that's kind of a ballpark figure, and it sounds a lot, but it's nothing compared to film.
I know. It's just a matter of infrastructure. And the cool thing and the hard thing about being in podcasting is it's a new medium. There's not many rules yet. You can kind of create your own thing, but the hard thing is people don't understand what it takes, what it costs. There's a lack of education, like in the public knowledge about this industry. It feels like a smaller industry than the film industry. I mean, I know Spotify went crazy and like certain platforms have put a lot of money into it, but it's still nascent.
It's still, I mean, that's what I do love about podcasting, that it is still a DIY level industry at one end, and yet at the pointy end we have all the celebrities, and inevitably the name Joe Rogan will come up, and money and influence and all that stuff. But that is the same with any of the digital media, whether you're looking at YouTube channels or TikTok or whatever. You're going to have that kind of celebrity influence factor. But I do like the fact that podcasting can accommodate such a wide range of interests, and the niche thing is really what drives it in many ways.
I was curious about, there's a trend of the host or the documentary filmmaker, the documentary director, producers from coming out from behind the camera or behind the microphone and being more a part of the story. I was curious what you think about that, like why that's happening.
So this is something that I started noticing was different in the podcast versus the radio or print journalism world. I mean, it's not that different. Let's be clear. Journalists putting themselves in the story goes right back before Norman Mailer, Daniel Defoe. It goes way back if you study it academically. But in the normal world of media that we operate in, it became fairly common in the 60s with people like Norman Mailer and Joan Didion, people like that, those writers that were writing in the New Yorker magazine. That's at the fancy end of journalism, if you like. Mm-hmm. In radio, the documentaries I grew up listening to were like that sort of BBC or NPR thing where you just kept yourself out and this happened, here are the people it happened to. But you, the person, was just there to answer the who, what, where, when, why, how, and not become part of the story. And in fact, it was a no-no. It was considered totally a massive breach of ethics even. But in podcasting, I mean, I do think that Sarah Koenig had a lot to do with it because she started experimenting with that in serials, saying, do I think this? What do I think? And, inviting you as the listener to join her on this quest and making it very transparent that she didn't have all the answers and this was an ongoing thing. And that was really alluring, and it was something everybody could identify with. It became a point of connection. And then advertisers start to get in on this. So they call it the parasocial relationship. And once they can see that listeners are really invested in a host, dollar signs go off and they start thinking, we can monetize this. Yes. If she starts talking about her preferred brand of peanut butter, hey, we're on a winner, And so then we start getting this thing where even the NPR hosts start talking, the former NPR hosts, the ones who have now left and made their own podcasts, start reading ads for mattresses and things. And underwear, undies. And I thought that was a bit less than edifying, but if it sort of supported making a good show, so long as they separated it out with a jingle or a sting so that you knew it was an ad, I was okay with it. You can't be too precious because how do you fund yourself if you're a freelance journalist? But what I don't like is the trend now that you see in shows like The Rest is History, which is huge, even in the US and also in the UK. It's two UK historians who are very funny and witty and know their stuff. So it's not surprising it's popular. But they now kind of, at least in one or two episodes I heard, they were advertising a sort of travel credit card. And they were talking about French history. It wasn't their big French Revolution series. It was another one. And they're in a cafe in Paris. And then they suddenly start saying, yeah, and Dom, I'm using my something card to get a coffee here. And the next they're talking back about Marie Antoinette. And I thought that was really low. I just thought it was off.
It's off-putting.
It's horrible. It kind of breaks the contract of trust we put in them. And, they're making a fortune already. So why do they need to go even further? To me, it's greed and it's wrong. And I actually tweeted about it, and I don't think they liked it because they had been kind of liking stuff and then it stopped. But I mean,
I'm so glad that, you're an academic and a thought leader. So you're the perfect person to stand up for ethics in podcasting and just,
Yeah. Well, maybe I can tell you I have a lot less followers than they have on any of these platforms. But it has to be said, yes, I think I agree with you. If we don't do it, we don't have an axe to grind. So we are able to. We have that luxury, if you like, of being able to speak out. But in other ways, it's really interesting to me how it's happening. So I worked with Richard Baker, who was a very well-known print journalist, really lots of awards, great guy. And I noticed at the beginning, he was a bit wooden. He would admit this. It took him a while to adapt. But then when he started doing his second podcast, he was talking about this cultural practice of child brides that had been happening in a remote part of Australia. And he said, I keep wondering, how would my own 10-year-old daughter feel about this? And I said to him afterwards, why did you reference your daughter? And he said, it just happened naturally. And he said, my feeling is, because he had never used the word I before in all his journalism. He had never even used the word I, but only in podcasting. Not only was he saying I, he was mentioning his own daughter. And he said, I think it's because my voice is already in listeners' ears, you're already part of the story. You can't just be absent the way you can on the page through the passive, well, not the passive voice, but just through extracting yourself, the first person. And he said, so you risk sounding alien and inhuman if you're not reacting to what's on around you. And so he felt that he had a responsibility to bring in his own response to things as they happened. So it's tricky because if you do that too much, you're toppling into self-indulgence and
Right.
even narcissism. And you don't want that. It's all me, me, me.
Right.
And that becomes really off-putting. And as listeners, you don't want somebody who's big noting themselves all the time. No. Especially not if they're just an ordinary person. You know, they're not some kind of celebrity. So it's a hard one to kind of get right. But I like it. I think Wind of Change, Patrick Radden Keefe did it brilliantly on that CIA, that funny kind of romp into the CIA. Did they write a song that was perhaps going to change the whole Cold War? He was very clever with it, but I mean, he is a clever guy with lots of experience. So I think it's harder to navigate when you're just starting out. We did it in The Greatest Menace. We made it. Pat, the host, is from an Arab Australian background, and that's a traditionally anti-gay community. Like he's open about that, and he was navigating his own struggle about coming out as a gay man, even to his mother and his family. It was a very protracted experience, and Simon and I, as co-producers, were saying, we really think this would be a very deeply emotional and affecting counter story to the big historical narrative if you feel comfortable about putting it out there. And at the beginning he was saying, no, I don't put myself in the story. It will look like personal vomit. It's all about me. But when we were able to reassure him, no, it's really honest and moving. And if your mother is open to having her up and down journey of acceptance recorded, this would really enhance it and really help other people who are struggling with this issue. And in the end, he did allow us. He said, yeah, okay, let's do it. And it really makes it much stronger for that. So when it's done right, I think the subjective storytelling and making the host, if you like, a character in the story can be a really important, salient aspect of a good narrative podcast.
I agree. As I was listening back to Serial today, I was thinking, I love being in this woman's mind. And I don't know everything about her. She didn't give me her whole biography. Little bits about her were coming through naturally when it related to the bigger story.
Yeah, even that famous bit where she's traveling with Dana Chivas, who is the producer. I was actually on a panel with Dana in Barcelona 6 months after Serial came out. That was really interesting because, we got some of the inside story. But there's that famous bit when they've been trying to check the phones in Leakin Park and see where they ping off the cell towers. And then on the way back, they're talking about, what does this mean for the story? And then Dana says, oh, look, there's a sale on at the Shrimp Shack or whatever it is, some local seafood outlet. And Sarah actually says, because the recorder's going, and she says, sometimes I think she never listens to me. And it's like part of the story. And I really love that because that happens. When you're interviewing somebody, you suddenly start thinking, oh, I must remember to pick up some mushrooms on the way home for dinner. And then you're back and you're kind of, whoops, focus, But it was like a thought overheard that she just spoke, and because the recorder was going. But they did get some flack. Like some people said, oh, no, that was very disrespectful because they're talking about a murder and blah, blah. But my response to that is, we're human. You are human. And even those people who are looking into tragedies have to eat, have to live. They have families. They have, personal lives that intrude.
They're not in the middle. They're not in the middle of preventing a murder. It's already happened 15 years ago or whatever. And they're trying to figure it out. And it's dramatic, but it's not.
Yeah. So I really like that. I mean, I think there's a lot about it on Reddit and various things. But I think it was a beautiful moment. Yeah.
I think that's what I like about Serial. Mysteries are the perfect type of story for a narrative podcast. And I can get wrapped up in murder mysteries, and even though I'm going to have nightmares and have trouble sleeping, I'll I'm so curious that I'll fight through it and suffer the following night. But I liked Serial because they made it dramatic enough, but it wasn't so scary that it was like hard to listen to. For me, I'm very sensitive.
No. And it wasn't salacious. You know, they didn't just titillate. They didn't go after juicy details and parade them in any way. They really did treat everybody as human. It's all about human nature, and it's about why would somebody do this and who's this person and what was in their character that might have led them to take a risk here or avoid a risk there. And that's the stuff that really is interesting. And of course, that's the stuff that Truman Capote brought out way back in Cold Blood when he looked at the two guys who killed the family in Kansas way back. And that started the whole non-fiction novel, he called it. That started the whole genre.
So kind of doing a big loop-de-loop back to what we were talking about, the fact that more and more producers, directors, interviewers, journalists are sharing more of their reaction, their perspective. I think it's great because the idea that any human could be completely impartial or completely unbiased or completely analytical at this point in humanity is not realistic. And so I feel more trusting of journalists who are open with who they are and where they're coming from and any biases they might have. Because then I'm like, well, they have that, at least they have some self-awareness and they're sharing that with me. And so I can like factor that in to the version of the story they're giving me.
It is changing how it really, the big word is to humanize. It's really allowing hosts and journalists to be fully people. Mm-hmm. Yes, let's be real. To a degree, they are performing. They're performing a persona. They're still not letting you in exactly the way they would if you were actually in their home. Of course, they've got to keep a vestige of boundaries and all the rest of it. But there is something approaching getting close to a relationship with the host, and it is huge. It's huge just in money terms. I mean, that is why, again, Joe Rogan. It's huge. Yeah.
It's hard not to like him, even if you don't like him. He's just, there's something so approachable about the way that he talks, and it's entertaining and funny, and sometimes he asks questions that I don't like, but he asks some pretty good questions and questions that you would want to ask. I think that was kind of what Oprah was so good at. She would ask questions that you wanted to ask, and even if they were dumb questions, you know? And
yeah, she is very good. I've just been listening to her new podcast now. I like Oprah because she mentioned my book.
Oh, wow. That's
yeah,
so cool.
Yeah, the Oprah Winfrey Network mentioned it. They wanted to look into these aspects of parasocial and stuff. But yeah, look, the problem, I don't really want to get into Joe Rogan because I haven't listened enough to him, but I did listen to him for an article I wrote. But the problem is he's too credulous. He doesn't challenge enough. I mean, yes, I hear what you say, that might make him seem, appealing. And certainly I've heard him do in some of the summation interviews, especially ones with people who've had personal issues like addiction or whatever. He has been very empathetic. At a personal level, he can relate. That was good, or he sounded like he could relate. The problem is where he doesn't challenge people who have got outrageous views enough, and he just lets them have the floor, and that's his modus. And he will say, well, I'm not a journo. I'm this guy who just has a podcast.
That's a really, good point.
Yeah, it's a kind of get out of jail free card. But he's nothing like as bad as, say, an Andrew Tate, who is actually advocating disgusting misogynistic stuff. And there's a kind of a spectrum of these bro guys.
I know. And I hate to say it, but I think they won the election in America. Ooh. I mean, podcasting, I have at least one friend who I was surprised voted for Trump, and, it was because of a podcast.
Wow.
So just anecdotally in my own life.
Yeah. No, I think so. I tweeted about this actually because I remember being amazed when Obama went on Mark Maron, the WTF, that podcast back in 2015, which was when I was on that panel with Dana Chivvis, and at Barcelona was a big media summit. All the big Washington Post editor was there. All kinds of important people were there. And they were all just beginning to think, what can podcasts do? Why are they so special? Remember, this was 6 months after Serial came out, so nobody really understood yet. And I remember being amazed listening to that interview with Obama. Obama could have gone anywhere. At that time, he was absolutely cruising. He could have gone on any medium, any show, and he chose Mark Maron's garage because he knew, because he's so savvy with media, he knew that he could put across this cool dude sort of persona that is part of who he is, because he's such a chameleon. He can be a range of things. But they did amazing, really deep discussions, and he actually infamously used the N-word when discussing racism, because it was okay in that context. At least he would contend that this is perfectly what we have to do. But he would never have used that word if he was on CNN or any of these TV shows, Fox News. So that was the start of it, really, I think. Understanding that podcasting as a medium can go where other places can't in media. And then the problem was that Kamala Harris, her people didn't understand that to be on a podcast like this, you can't treat it like it's a TV show. You have to get loose, and you have to really put in the time. And she only did this 45-minute thing. I know she went on Call Her Daddy, but you need to just hang back and get chatty and not be scripted. And for whatever reason that we will probably never know, she didn't do that, because I'm sure she has that kind of lots in her personality that could have come out with the right platform, but it didn't happen.
She didn't do as many. The Democrats didn't do nearly as many as the Republicans did.
Yeah.
And there aren't as many Chumcast type shows on the Democratic side in America. Like, I think the only big one we have is Pod Save America.
Yes.
Which is very good. I'm hoping to have a producer from that show on the format. That'd be exciting.
Good.
I feel like you and I could talk forever.
By the way, good on you for getting your business happening. I've looked at, your series, and it's got very good, well-defined topics, and it sounds very professional.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I go through periods where I don't have work, and I have to always be promoting myself, and I always need to be learning, and so that's how the format was born.
No, that's great. Okay, Flo. Well, I hope you have everything you need, and we've covered a lot.
I'm excited to share our episode. I think it's going to be packed full of good nuggets.
Thank you for listening to The Format. Head to substack.com, that's substack.com, to subscribe to The Format on Substack for our next monthly episode and blog about the future of podcasting. Stay real.